Today, we're going to talk about responsive grid design in ZK, a sneak peek into what ZK10 is going to, ZK10.4 is going to bring to the table to make responsiveness easier to achieve, and how it works. This presentation is going to be on a new feature that we're going to bring into the next ZK release. Even though it's still currently in development, I don't expect to see a lot of changes. So this should be about as close to what you're going to see in your real application as it gets. As usual, we're going to record this presentation. The presentation itself, as well as the code samples, any materials that I'm going to be displaying will be available for download or for access after the presentation is over. So don't worry too much about taking note. Everything's going to be there if you want to access it. As usual, I'll do a Q&A at the end. If you have any question, feel free to either ask them at that time, or if you think the question is relevant to the current discussion that I'm having, or to the current slide I'm showing, feel free to ask them in the chat. If I can, I'll answer it then. If it's more relevant for Q&A, I'll wait for Q&A. Okay. So without further ado, and sorry for the microphone issue at the start, let's have a quick refresher on what responsive design is. I'm assuming this is probably familiar for everyone here, but just to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. So very, very, very shortly, what is responsive design? Responsive design is the understanding that not every device is the same, and that your application ideally should look nice and should be useful at any resolution. How does that work? That can take many aspects, but the two main aspects that we're going to focus on for responsive design is it is adaptive. When you are on a large screen, you have a view that is adapted to that large screen. When you are on a mobile device with a very short screen available width, you're going to display a different design that is adapted to it. And then you have the fact that this is a dynamic layout. You don't need to open a dedicated mobile page when you're on mobile. You don't need to open a dedicated widescreen page when you are on a desktop with a widescreen. The page itself should adapt and dynamically serve proper content to the device, depending on what it detects. This is quite a large topic. In fact, we've had a series of articles, small talks, examples. There's quite a lot of it. If you want further reading on the general principle of responsiveness in ZK, I've included a link to our small talks. And in the further reading section, I've also included additional resources that can be of interest if you want to go on a deeper dive on that topic. For today, we're going to stay at that understanding that we want the user to have a comfortable experience with good readability, whether they're on a large device or a small device. Okay, so now let's talk about the grid problem. What's the grid problem in a responsive environment? The grid problem is that by nature, a grid is here to display tabular data. Data that can be expressed in a form of a table. So anything that you pull from a database request in the form of rows of data inside of a database, anything that is displaying a collection of items with several properties that you want to display cell by cell. All of those things are very readable and very easy for the end user to get a visual grasp on, if you are in such a situation where you have enough available screen space that you can comfortably put all of your content in columns with enough space in the cell for the columns to just host it. If you try and take that design and you squish it down to the size where it would fit on, let's say, a phone screen, what you're going to end up with is either a scroll bar, because you will have to go from left to right in order to go see the rest of the content, or you're going to have content that is extremely condensed horizontally, which will inevitably lead to cell that extends vertically. All of that to say, there is a minimum size at which a grid stops being useful, because the user can no longer process the data correctly, or they cannot see all of the data at once, or they need to do some sort of annoying operation that makes it difficult for them to get a proper read of the data. That's something we're going to keep in mind as we go forward, because it is the core issue that we want to address in this new feature, the ZK10.4 responsive grid. So before we get into the new feature itself, let's quickly talk about how you would create a grid in ZK that serves both a mobile device and a desktop device. The first thing we're going to look at is just what I quickly touched upon. Why do you want to use a grid? You want to use a grid because you have tabular data, because you want it to be readable, because you want it to be easily navigated. What does a ZK grid do for you? If you are using a standard ZK grid, it is very reliable in the sense that it does one thing and it does it well. It puts your data in columns and in lines, and it just gives you cell, 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 column, 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 put all of that well organized, easy to read. What happens if that grid shrinks down? We're going to see the exact readability issue that I mentioned. If you go from a large enough screen with columns that are designed to be readable on a computer screen, with cells that contain text that is designed to be read on a computer screen, if you go below a certain width available for your component, the column starts to truncate. The content either has to be scrolled, or in this case, it gets over and over vertically large, and it makes it somewhat difficult to read. Okay. What does that look from a code point of view? I'll just quickly introduce the code I'm going to be using for all of those examples, because it is essentially the same code. I'm using a standard ZK grid with columns with a template name model. If you've ever created a grid in ZK, you should probably be familiar with that pattern. I have a grid composer. The only thing that grid composer does is creating the model data and assigning it to the grid. This might as well be if you're using MVVM, it could simply be a model assignation on a grid. There's literally nothing else happening here. Okay, so we want some level of responsiveness. There is quite a lot of ways to achieve responsiveness in a ZK grid. How do you do it the manual way? You do it the manual way either at server side, at client side. If you do it at server side, you would be using a client info event or another event that lets you identify either the size of the screen or the available size in the parent of the grid. If you do it at client side, you do it with CSS, with media queries, for example, and you do it using templating, because you already have tabular data. You just need a different way to express that data in a visual manner that is parsable on a mobile screen. How would that look if you wanted to do it in what I would call the basic approach? You would go and you would create two objects. You'd have here your grid with a grid composer that assigns the model to the grid. And you would have a different object. In this case, I'm using a div element that creates a different structure. In this case, I used a card structure to create a number of objects This is a card that I'm going to be iterating on, which will just create a HTML structure based on your tabular data. So you're switching from displaying that tabular data into a grid form to a card form, but it stays the same data. And then you add some CSS to it. Very simply, you'd use, in this case, I used a media query. Media query is a very simple way to identify the size of your screen and to define a breakpoint before which you're going to use a mobile version, after which you're going to be using a desktop version. And I simply just switch which one is being displayed by using either display none or display block. In practice, this would look a little bit like this. When you're on a short width on your browser, or if you're using a mobile device, you would be switching to the mobile version of the data structure. And if you are on a larger available screen space, you'd be switching to the grid display version of the data structure. So one thing that might be immediately obvious here is this is not very difficult, but it's not nothing. It requires creating additional composers. It requires creating additional objects, in which case my card structure. It requires doing the iteration over your data structure. In this case, I'm doing a simple display, but if you have events such as buttons to do operations on each of the lines, you also have to add extra controls to that. Point being, while this is not impossible to do, it is effort. All right, so what can we do better going forward? We are introducing a simple attribute that you can put on your grid, which is the responsive attribute. Currently, it can be responsive stacking, which is going to go take your grid into a stacking format when it is at a lower resolution, or it can be no responsive behavior. With the understanding that you could also implement custom behaviors here, or you could customize the current option, or that you could simply disable it if you don't want to have responsiveness. What does that look like in a browser? If we go here, you're going to see that we have a substantially similar behavior here, except I would call that a little bit better because you've got all of the grid styling already available. You have your grid effects available, and we are automatically tracking down things like the column names to put the appropriate value in the right place. What does that look like from a code point of view? This was here, our default ZK grid. This is here, this one is our responsive grid. If you compare the two files very quickly, you'll find that the difference is not very large. So from activating that feature, if you want only the default behaviors, what you would need to do is simply add that attribute right here. And yeah, let's go back to see it in action. Desktop size, you have your regular grid. If you go down enough to need a more compact design, you switch to the stacking design instead. All right. Now, you may be using some feature of the grid that are a little bit more complex. Let's say, for example, that you are using a grid with paging or any other additional thing. So in this case, we have a grid that has both the paging attribute, the paging mode, and the frozen component, which freezes two of the columns at the start of the grid. So we have our content on the right, which can be scrolled through. We have our frozen columns on the left, which are stuck in place. And we have our paging control, which lets us go from page 1 to page 5 in this scenario. If we go down to the responsive step, we no longer have frozen because frozen is no longer relevant here. It's not a component that makes sense at this responsive stage. So while it is still active if you go back to the larger step, when you go down to the stacking design, it is just ignored. And you still have the paging. The paging still applies. You can still go see the same objects in the same page. And if you go, currently we're on page 3. If you go and you go back to the larger size, you will see that we also maintain the state of the component. We only change the way the data is displayed. All right. A few more things to say about that. Now that you've seen the main point of the feature, we have a little bit of extra information about how exactly it works, how you can configure it. What if you want something that is slightly different than the default behavior? First, the attributes that you can set on the grid. Those attributes are controlling the grid behavior at the different responsive stages. The first one is the attribute I've already introduced, the responsive attribute. It accepts either stacking, which is the built-in stacking mode that I've already displayed, or none. This is what you would put if you only want a regular grid that behaves the same at all responsive stages. You also have your responsive columns. This is going to let you use a bootstrap grid style declarative step to indicate what you want your grid to do at different responsive level. So in this case, if you're familiar with bootstrap grid, you just use those values to indicate at small size, I want a column size, a column split of 1. At medium size, I want a split of 2. At large size, I don't want any split. The default value for the ZK stacking is going to be 1 at small and nothing at medium or larger. But let's give you a quick example and go and put small 1, medium 2, and large none. If we go to our responsive grid here, I'm going to add the responsive columns attribute. We're going to have small -1, medium -2, and large none. I'll go back to my web browser. And if we go and trigger the first responsive step, now we have the medium step. You can see on the medium step, we wanted 2 columns. So we have our different cars that are displayed 2 by 2, 2 on each line. If we go further down, we're going to eventually trigger the small step. And now we switch to an even more condensed display where we're going to only show 1 card per line to make it more readable. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is the responsive visible attribute on the column object. Not every data that you have in your grid when it is at the maximum size might be relevant to your user if you want a condensed view at smaller sizes. So let's go back to our code and let's take a look at the columns. Product name is definitely something we always want to display. Unit price is relevant, but description and manufacturer are not necessary information to be displayed if we are at a smaller responsive step. So following the attribute, we want to declare responsive visible, false. So this indicates to the grid that when you reach the stacking mode, those two columns, the description and the manufacturer, can be omitted. They will still be available when you are on the larger grid size. But when you reach a point where you need to condense the data for readability, you will simply just keep those when displaying that data. Again, it still exists. If you move back to the larger size, you will see that those fields are still available. They've not been purged from the data layer. They're simply left out of the rendering when doing the rendering at lower resolution. All right. What else do we have to discuss? The default global values. That's not something I'm going to spend too much time on because it's fairly self-explanatory. If you want to set a default behavior for your grid, you can set the default responsiveness behavior and the default columns behavior for your entire application from your zk.xml. It works like every other library property you've always set. Again, this is common sense enough that I don't think I need to to spend too much time on it. Java control, ZK components, as you well know, are Java objects. You do not have to be in Azul file if you want to set those attributes. You've seen me set the set responsive columns, and the set responsive visible value from the Zul side. If you have a composer, if you have anything that interacts with your grid as a Java component, as a Java object, you have your getters, you have your setters, you can set it, you can read it. It all works as every other feature that your ZK component do. New events. This one is actually more interesting, so I'm going to spend a little bit more time on it. When you change the size of your grid from a responsive step to a different responsive step. So in this case, when I go from the desktop mode to the responsive mode here, the responsive grid will now have an event that you can listen to in order to do something at that stage, if you need to catch when this occurs. This new event is the on-responsive mode change. It does not fire on bind, so when you create the grid from the first time, you do not get an event that tells you the grid has been created. Here's an event we're in desktop mode, or here's an event we are in stacking mode. Instead, it will trigger from the first time the user or the page itself causes the grid to go over that responsive step and to change its responsive mode. You also get the current available mode in the event get data. So if you want to do something when you're in stacking mode or when you're in table mode, you'll get that information simply by getting the data from the event. All right. Before we go on to the further reading section, I'll mention an additional interesting point here. Just to make sure that you don't get tricked by my using of responsive media queries at CSS level earlier, I'll point out that the behavior of the grid is a behavior that is tied to the width of the grid itself. It is not tied to the width of the browser tab that hosts the grid. So for example, here I have a grid that is inside a window. When that window resizes, if the grid goes under the responsiveness step, that grid is going to trigger the responsive step. It is tied to how much space the grid itself has in order to display its content, and not tied to the potential available space on the screen. All right. There is a few other things that I'll invite you to review once you have access to the responsive grid itself. If you want to change the responsive steps, that's something you can do. By default, the ZK responsive steps are baked in, but you can change them. I believe, yeah, you can change them with a CSS declaration. If you have an interest, we can go into the further reading or in the Q&A after that. I don't want to keep everyone else on the call if not, because this is more the nitty-gritty of when do you want to step into the stacking mode, when do you want to stay into the desktop mode, that kind of thing. All right. And we're reaching the end of the presentation. It's a short one, admittedly, but the feature itself is not, I would expect, too difficult to understand. So yeah, if you want some further reading, again, you'll have that slide available with the links. You will be able to find the sample code for everything I've shown you on screen today on GitHub. You have the responsive design Smalltalks on our Smalltalk page. If you want some more in-depth discussion of what responsiveness entails in a ZK page if you're not using the responsive grid. And if you want some example of manually implementing grid responsiveness, I've also included a link to our documentation GitHub. Okay. I see that I have a question up. Will responsive grid be available only in ZK10 or ZK9 later? The responsive grid is for ZK10.4. This is not expected to be backported to the ZK9 branch. Does it work with master detail? That's an interesting question. That's not something I actually tested. What I can tell you what I expect, and then we can have a quick look and test it together. So master detail is, in the way I understand it, something that's going to be displayed in the grid when it is in desktop mode. I don't expect it to be translated into something you can use in stacking mode, but let's have a quick look. We're going to go into our responsive grid here. I may have to create a grid. Just give me a quick second so I can just pull my master detail reference. And in the meantime, let's see if I can answer any other question. Nice to have a grid. Is it also for a list box component, which is more complex? Currently, this is only for the grid. So this is not currently expected to be available on the list box or on the tree, which are our two other tabular components. That said, we do listen to feedback. If you do have a strong need for this type of behavior in other ZK tabular component, make it known. We discuss this type of thing with our dev team. If there is enough traction behind it, this is definitely a discussion we can have. And I see another question, listbox entries stay non-responsive. Same answer, we don't currently implement a behavior like this on those components, but if you do have an interest in seeing it, make it known. As I said, again, we do listen to feedback. Let's just make a quick label value test master detail, and let's see how that behaves. All right, we are in, I'm in the default grid. What am I doing? Let's go back to the responsive grid. Okay. I'm going to put that here, go back to my presentation. Okay. So now we have our master detail. We have the master detail created with our test master detail value. As you can see, when we're in desktop mode, nothing changes. if we do step down, we do have, actually, I was not expecting that to actually perform, but we do have the master detail, and when we open the master detail opens into the next card over. Um, so I learned something today. That was actually a good question. Um, I see some feedback that listbox entry would also be appreciated. I see, I see. So yeah, and if you do want to test any other advanced feature of the grid, I'll point out that you can already, if you have access to our Maven server, make a test project using our current 10.4 Freshly, and already have access to those features. If you want this specific project, again, it's going to be already available on GitHub in our demo repositories. And the link to it will be available in the slides when the slides are made public after the call. Where does it open master detail in one column mode? Let's take a look, but I fully expect it to be directly under it. It is directly under it. Yeah, it just opens another card just below the previous cards. All right. Let's see. I think we went over everything I was expecting to discuss today. If you have further question, I invite you to put them in the next 2 minutes or so. Otherwise, we might be wrapping up. We use a lot of grid and list boxes. It would be great to have this for both. That's noted. I do see feedbacks from more than one sources, so that's definitely something I'll bring up to our dev team. I cannot make, of course, any prediction about when this would be in. If it is not in the current release, it will at least be discussed and be discussed for future integration. All right. All right, all right. Let's see. Do we have anything else? Any other question before we wrap for today? You're welcome. And I hope you appreciated the sneak peek into our development cycle. Just to get a quick overview of one of the many things we're working on at the moment. Okay, I don't see any more question at the moment, so I'm going to say thank you everyone for being here in the presentation today. I hope that was interesting, and I hope to see you in a future presentation next time we do one of these. Have a good day, and as again, for one last time, all of the material are going to be available. Keep an eye out, and if you have any feedback, don't hesitate to contact us either by email or directly if you want to see anything specific or if you want to give your opinion on what you've seen so far. All right. With that, have a good day.